What if the Sumerian priests weren't singing to appease their gods, but activating something? What if those strange repetitive hymns carved into temple walls with their precise syllable counts and rigid tonal structures were never meant to be music at all, but instructions, frequencies, a technology we've forgotten how to hear? In the scorched silence of southern Iraq, clay tablets still wait in museum basements. Their surfaces still carry impressions made by scribes who pressed the same patterns again and again, as if accuracy mattered more than beauty. Tablets that describe walls rising at the sound of the word, stones that floated like clouds at the voice of the priest. 5,000 years of silence. One question waiting to be asked. So before the story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that vibrate at the edge of the possible, consider subscribing. Now, let the ancient frequencies begin. In 1929, French archaeologists working at the ancient site of Ugarit on the Syrian coast unearthed a collection of clay tablets that would take decades to properly understand. Tablets covered in cuneiform script that contained something no one expected to find preserved in mud 4,000 years old. What appeared to be musical notation, and not just any music, but hymns, religious songs, prayers set to specific melodic patterns with instructions for performance that seemed almost obsessively detailed. The tablets sat in museum collections for years, studied by linguists who could read the words but couldn't decode the musical symbols. Those strange marks above and below the text that clearly meant something, that clearly specified something. But what exactly remained a mystery until a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, named Anne Draffcorn-Kilmer, spent years in the 1960s and early 1970s painstakingly comparing these musical notations with other Mesopotamian texts, cross-referencing symbols, building a dictionary of ancient musical terminology, until in 1974 she published her breakthrough, a paper that demonstrated these tablets contained not vague melodic suggestions, but precise mathematical intervals, exact specifications for the distance between notes, the duration of each tone, the specific strings on the lyre that must be plucked, and in what order. What Kilmer discovered changed everything scholars thought they knew about ancient music. Because these weren't folk songs passed down with natural variation from singer to singer, these weren't hymns that could be adapted and personalized like modern worship music. These were rigid, fixed, mathematically precise compositions that had to be performed exactly as written or not at all. And the question that began to trouble some researchers was simply this: why would a prayer require such technical precision? Why would communication with the divine demand exact frequencies rather than sincere intention? Why would the gods care whether a priest hit a perfect fifth or an imperfect one? Unless, of course, the gods weren't listening for sincerity at all, unless something else entirely was responding to the sound. The tablets specified not just notes, but instruments. Not just instruments, but the materials those instruments must be made from, the type of wood for the lyre body, the metal for the strings, the animal gut or plant fiber that would produce the correct resonance. And this level of detail makes no sense if you're simply trying to create beautiful music for worship. This level of detail only makes sense if you're trying to produce very specific acoustic effects, if you're trying to generate particular frequencies with particular timbres at particular amplitudes, if you're trying to do something with sound rather than simply make sound. A prayer can be whispered in the dark of night when no one else can hear. A prayer can be shouted into storms. A prayer can be sung off-key by children who don't know the proper melody. And we assume, most of us assume, that the divine listens to the heart rather than the frequency, that intention matters more than precision, that sincerity trumps technique. But the Sumerian priests believed something very different. They believed that the exact frequency mattered absolutely. They believed that deviation from the prescribed pattern would cause the ritual to fail entirely. They believed, or perhaps they knew from long experience, that certain specific sounds produced certain specific effects, and that getting it wrong meant getting nothing at all. The oldest city in the world, or at least the oldest city we can currently identify with confidence, rose from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia sometime around 5400 BCE at a place the Sumerians called Eridu, a name that translates roughly as mighty place or powerful place. And at the heart of Eridu stood the first temple in recorded history, a small structure that was rebuilt and expanded 17 times over millennia, each new version constructed directly atop the ruins of the previous one, maintaining the same sacred geometry, the same orientation, the same fundamental architecture, even as the building grew larger and more elaborate with each generation. This was the temple of Enki, the god of wisdom, of fresh waters, of the primordial creative force that the Sumerians called the Abzu, a concept usually translated as the freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the earth, the source of all springs and rivers, the deep waters that sustain life. But the Abzu was more than just underground water. The texts describe it as a place of power, a realm where certain forces could be accessed. It's where certain transformations could occur, and the temple of Enki at Eridu was built specifically to connect with this power, to tap into whatever the Abzu represented. When archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 1950s, they found something curious about the temple's architecture that wasn't immediately explained by religious function alone. A series of chambers and corridors that seemed designed to channel and amplify sound, walls at specific angles that would reflect acoustic waves in particular patterns, spaces that functioned less like rooms for human occupation and more like resonating chambers for acoustic phenomena. Recent archaeoacoustic studies, a relatively new field that applies acoustic science to archaeological sites, have measured the resonant frequencies of the Eridu temple ruins and found something remarkable. Frequencies that match with surprising precision the intervals specified in those hymn tablets discovered at Ugarit and elsewhere, as if the building itself was tuned to the same scale as the sacred music, as if temple and hymn were designed together as components of a single system. The texts speak of the temple singing at certain hours, of sounds that emerged from the structure at dawn and dusk, of vibrations that pilgrims could feel in their bodies when the priests performed the proper rituals. And while mainstream scholarship interprets these descriptions as poetic metaphor for religious experience, the acoustic measurements suggest another possibility entirely. The temple was not just a building, it was an instrument. The priests were not just singing, they were playing it. They were generating specific frequencies within a structure designed to amplify and focus those frequencies, creating acoustic effects that we can barely imagine with our modern assumptions about what ancient technology could accomplish. The worshippers who entered that temple and felt the walls humming around them, who heard sounds that seemed to come from the stones themselves, were not experiencing supernatural phenomena. They were experiencing physics, acoustics, the deliberate manipulation of sound waves by people who understood principles we are only now beginning to rediscover. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that was recited annually during the New Year festival in Babylon, tells the story of how the god Marduk created the world, and the mechanism of that creation is consistently, repeatedly, emphatically described as speech, as sound, as the power of the spoken word to reshape reality itself. When Marduk demonstrates his power to the assembled gods before his battle with the chaos dragon Tiamat, he does so by speaking. He utters words and a constellation appears. He utters words and the constellation vanishes. He creates and uncreates through pure vocalization, and the gods, seeing this power, grant him kingship over all things. The text states it plainly. He spoke, and it was. He commanded, and it stood. This phrase echoes forward through history into the Hebrew Bible, into the Gospel of John, into religious traditions that span the globe, and we have come to read it as metaphor, as symbolic language describing the mystery of divine will. You're the ineffable power of God to bring forth existence from nothing through sheer intention. But the Mesopotamians, the people who first wrote these words, may have meant something more literal, something more technical, something that our modern assumptions about the limits of ancient knowledge have prevented us from seeing. Another tablet, fragmentary but legible, describes the walls of Babylon rising at the word of the god, stones coming together in perfect alignment because the proper sounds were uttered, the proper frequencies generated, the proper vibrations sent through earth and air. Mainstream scholarship categorizes this as foundation mythology, as the kind of legendary origin story every great city tells about itself. But the terminology used in these passages is specific in ways that undercut the purely mythological interpretation. The word for word in these texts, the Akkadian term shiptu, is the same word used for incantation, and more precisely for ritualized chanting with prescribed tones. Not just any speech, but specific sounds uttered in specific patterns with specific frequencies. When the text says Marduk spoke, it may be using the same word that elsewhere describes priests generating exact acoustic patterns in temple rituals, which raises a question that conventional scholarship rarely asks. What if God spoke, and it was, is not metaphor for divine will, but description of acoustic technology? What if the ancients were preserving, in the only language available to them, memories of techniques that actually worked, methods for manipulating physical reality through carefully controlled sound? The same pattern appears in traditions around the world. In Hindu cosmology, the universe begins with Om, the primordial sound from which all creation flows. In Jewish mysticism, God creates through speaking the Hebrew letters, each letter carrying specific vibrational properties. In ancient Egyptian thought, the god Ptah creates through his heart and his tongue, through thought given form as speech. These parallels are usually explained as convergent mythology, as independent cultures arriving at similar metaphors for creation because certain patterns are psychologically satisfying to human minds. But there is another possible explanation. What if these are not independent inventions, but echoes of a common source? Memories of a time when humans understood something about the relationship between sound and matter that we have since forgotten. knowledge that was preserved in religious language, because religious language was the only vessel strong enough to carry it through the dark ages of civilizational collapse. The Lugal-A, known in English as King of All Lands, or sometimes the Exploits of Ninurta, is a Sumerian epic poem dating to around 2000 BCE that tells the story of the warrior god Ninurta and his battle against a mountain that had risen in rebellion against the divine order. The mountain is populated by stones, and each stone is treated in the text as an individual entity with its own nature, its own properties, its own response to Ninurta's power. But what makes this text remarkable? What sets it apart from other ancient combat narratives is the precision with which these stones are categorized. The text describes diorite as having one nature, basalt as having another, limestone and granite and alabaster, each receiving specific treatment based on properties that the text describes in terms we might today recognize as acoustic. Each stone responds differently to Ninurta's power. Each stone has a different voice when struck. Each stone requires different handling based on these innate characteristics. Scholars have traditionally read this as mythology, as the personification of geological materials for poetic purposes. But recent analysis suggests something more intriguing. The terms used to describe these stones correlate not with visible properties like color or texture, but with properties that only become apparent when the stones interact with sound, with vibration. With the kind of forces that the priests might have been generating in their temple rituals. There is a passage in the Lugal-E that describes stones being called forth from quarries, not cut or dragged or transported, but called, summoned, brought into movement through some action that the text describes using the same terminology found in hymns and incantations. The word used for this calling is related to words for singing, for chanting, for producing specific ritualized sounds. Mainstream translation renders this as the god commanding and the stones obeying, which fits our assumptions about divine power in mythology. But if we read it more literally, if we take the text at its word, rather than interpreting through our modern assumptions, we find something remarkable. A description of quarrying that involves generating specific sounds to make specific types of stone move. The categorization of stones by acoustic properties, the description of calling them forth rather than physically extracting them, the detailed attention to which stones respond to which treatments. None of this makes sense if the text is purely mythological fancy, if the ancient poets were simply inventing colorful stories about gods and mountains. It makes perfect sense if the text is preserving, however imperfectly, memories of an actual technique, a method for moving stone using sound, a technology so different from anything we possess that we cannot recognize it even when the ancients describe it directly. Let your breathing deepen here. The complexity of these ancient texts will wash over you in waves. You do not need to hold every detail. Just feel the pattern emerging, the suggestion that what we have dismissed as poetry might have been precision, that what we have categorized as myth might have been manual, that the strange obsessive specificity of these ancient compositions, their exact frequencies and rigid structures and detailed instructions, might have served purposes we are only beginning to imagine. Now, we leave Mesopotamia behind and travel south along ancient trade routes that once connected the lands between the rivers to the kingdom of the Nile. Because if the Sumerian priests possessed acoustic knowledge that could influence stone, then we should expect to find echoes of this understanding in Egypt, that great civilization which rose along the banks of the Nile and built monuments that still confound our understanding of what ancient peoples could achieve. And indeed, when we examine the Egyptian textual record with fresh eyes, looking not just for religious mythology, but for technical specifications hidden within sacred language, we find exactly what we might expect to find if acoustic technology had spread along those ancient trade networks, or emerged independently from similar principles of observation and experimentation. The Westcar Papyrus, dating to approximately 1600 BCE, though describing events supposedly from the reign of Khufu himself, some 1,000 years earlier, contains accounts of magicians performing what we would call miracles, and the famous magician Jedi, who could allegedly reattach severed heads and command animals, draws most scholarly attention. But there are other passages less sensational, but perhaps more significant, that describe priests who could speak to stone, who could command materials to move and arrange themselves through the power of sacred utterance. And while Egyptologists naturally interpret these passages as mythological embellishment, as the kind of exaggeration that accumulates around powerful figures and sacred institutions over centuries of retelling, we must ask ourselves why this particular form of exaggeration, why, specifically, the power of voice over stone, when there are so many other miraculous abilities that could have been attributed to these ancient priests. The Shabaka stone, now housed in the British Museum, presents an even more intriguing case, because this basalt slab, dating to around 710 BCE, contains a creation theology that scholars call the Memphite theology, in which the god Ptah creates the world not through physical action, not through the separation of primordial waters or the defeat of chaos serpents, as in other Egyptian creation accounts, but through thought conceived in the heart and speech uttered by the tongue. And the text is explicit about this mechanism, stating that every divine word came into being through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. And while we can certainly read this as abstract theology, as a sophisticated philosophical statement about the relationship between consciousness and reality, we can also read it as the Egyptians did originally, as a literal or description of how creation works, as an account of sound and intention combining to shape physical matter. When researchers from Stanford University and the University of California conducted acoustic measurements inside Egyptian temples and tomb structures, they discovered something remarkable, that these spaces were not acoustically neutral, but had been designed or at least utilized to amplify specific frequency ranges. And the precision of this acoustic engineering was particularly evident in the older structures, as if the knowledge had been more complete in earlier periods and had gradually degraded over the centuries of Egyptian civilization, a pattern we have seen before in other contexts. The Great Pyramid of Giza presents the most striking evidence because when acoustic engineers measured the resonant frequency of the sarcophagus in the king's chamber, they found it resonates at approximately 110 Hertz, a frequency that falls within a range modern neuroscience has identified as significant for human consciousness. And when you stand in that chamber and produce a tone at this frequency, the entire structure seems to come alive. The granite walls vibrating in sympathy, the sound lasting far longer than it should, as if the chamber itself were designed to capture and amplify this particular vibration. Doctor, Robert Schoch of Boston University conducted research on the acoustic properties of the Sphinx enclosure and discovered that the curved walls surrounding the Sphinx would have functioned as a parabolic reflector, focusing and amplifying any sounds produced in that space. And he noted that the erosion patterns he famously attributed to water damage would not have significantly altered these acoustic properties, meaning that whatever ceremonies or practices took place before the Sphinx in its earliest periods would have occurred in an acoustically engineered environment where specific frequencies would have been magnified and projected with remarkable precision. The 110 Hz frequency that appears repeatedly in Egyptian sacred architecture is not arbitrary, because modern research conducted by Dr. Ian Cook and colleagues at UCLA demonstrated that exposure to sounds at this frequency produces measurable changes in brain activity, specifically a deactivation of the language centers in the left prefrontal cortex and a corresponding activation of areas associated with emotional processing and spatial awareness. And these brain changes are consistent with what we might call altered states of consciousness, the kind of expanded awareness that mystics and meditators have sought throughout human history, and that ancient priests may have induced through acoustic means rather than through purely psychological or pharmacological methods. The Egyptians didn't just build in stone, they built with stone as if it could listen, as if the material itself were a participant in whatever transformations occurred within these sacred spaces, and the precision with which they selected specific types of granite and limestone, the care with which they oriented chambers and passages, the attention they paid to dimensions that seem arbitrary until you calculate their acoustic implications. All of this suggests a civilization that understood something about the relationship between sound and matter that we are only beginning to rediscover through our modern scientific instruments. Let your awareness drift now as we travel across the Mediterranean Sea to a small archipelago that rises from deep blue waters where an even older mystery awaits. Because on the island of Malta, in a site called the Hypogeum of Sacsayhuamán, archaeologists discovered an underground temple complex that was carved from living limestone beginning around 4000 BCE and expanded over the following centuries into a 3-level labyrinth of chambers, halls and passages that extends more than 10 meters below the surface. And this structure predates the Great Pyramid by over 1,000 years, predates Stonehenge in its final form by nearly 2,000 years, yet displays acoustic engineering so sophisticated that modern researchers struggle to explain how it could have been achieved by people we assume had only stone tools and no formal understanding of acoustic physics. The Hypogeum was discovered accidentally in 1902 when workers constructing houses in the town of Paula broke through into the uppermost chambers, and what they found was a necropolis where the remains of over 7,000 individuals had been deposited over centuries, but also clearly a ceremonial space where rituals of profound importance had been conducted. And the most remarkable chamber of all is a small curved room on the second level, known as the oracle chamber, where the acoustic properties are unlike anything found in natural caves or simple carved spaces. When a male voice produces a tone at approximately 110 Hz in the oracle chamber, the sound does not simply echo, but resonates throughout the entire structure, vibrating the limestone walls and floor, creating a physical sensation that visitors describe as the stone itself, humming or singing, and remarkably female voices at their natural pitch do not produce this effect. Only deeper voices specifically calibrated to that particular frequency can activate the resonance. And this selectivity cannot be accidental because natural caves and carved spaces do not spontaneously develop such specific acoustic filtering properties. Research conducted by Paolo De Bertolis and colleagues from the University of Trieste measured the acoustic properties of the Hypogeum using modern equipment and confirmed what visitors had long reported, that the oracle chamber and connecting spaces were designed to amplify frequencies in a narrow band around 110 Hz. The same frequency found in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid thousands of miles away and built by an entirely different civilization. And they noted that the curved surfaces, the specific dimensions, the relationship between chambers, all contributed to this acoustic effect in ways that would require sophisticated understanding of sound behavior to achieve intentionally. Above ground on Malta stand the massive temples of Gantija on the neighboring island of Gozo temples that were constructed around 3600 BCE, making them among the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost anything else. Humanity has built that still survives, and the stones used in their constructions are immense, with some limestone blocks weighing over 50 tons, transported from quarries several kilometers away and raised into position through methods that remain unexplained by conventional archaeological models. Local Maltese tradition preserved through oral history for millennia before being recorded in writing tells of a giantess named Sansuna, who built these temples while carrying her child in one arm and the massive stones in the other. And she did this, the legends say, while singing, while producing continuous tones that seemed to make her impossible, labor somehow possible. And we can dismiss this as charming folk etymology, a simple explanation invented by people who could not conceive of the true engineering methods involved. Or we can notice that this legend, like so many others around the world, specifically connects song and sound to the movement of massive stones. A structure carved from living rock that only responds to certain frequencies, built 5,500 years ago by people we are told had only stone tools and basic social organization. And yet they created acoustic spaces that modern engineers would struggle to replicate with computer modeling and precision manufacturing. And the oracle chamber sits in darkness beneath the Maltese earth, still waiting, still resonating when the right frequency enters the space. And we must ask what these ancient builders were trying to amplify and why they devoted generations of labor to creating a resonance chamber that responds to a single narrow band of sound. And now let us travel further still across the Atlantic Ocean to the highlands of South America, where at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level on the shores of Lake Titicaca, stand the ruins of Tiwanaku and its associated site, Puma Punku structures, that represent some of the most enigmatic construction achievements of the ancient world. Because here, the precision of stonework exceeds what we find even in Egypt, with stones fitted so perfectly that the blade of a knife cannot be inserted between them, and with complex interlocking shapes that suggest an almost industrial level of manufacturing capability. And Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century recorded accounts from local inhabitants about how these structures were built, accounts that consistently referenced sound and music as essential elements of the construction or process. Garcilaso de la Vega, who was born in Cusco in 1539, to a Spanish conquistador father and an Incan princess mother, and who therefore had access to oral traditions that were still living memory in his childhood, wrote detailed accounts of Incan construction methods that he compiled in his royal commentaries of the Incas. And among his descriptions of how massive stones were moved and fitted, he mentions trumpets of gold being sounded during construction work, and while conventional interpretations assume these were merely ceremonial accompaniments, music to inspire workers and honor gods, Garcilaso's accounts suggest something more functional, that the trumpets were an integral part of the process, not decoration, but tool. And he describes specific sounds being made at specific moments during the movement and placement of stones. The Coricancha Temple in Cusco, once the most sacred site in the Incan Empire, was described by the Spanish as having walls covered in gold and containing gardens with golden replicas of plants and animals. And though the Spanish stripped the gold and built their church of Santo Domingo, over the foundations they could not remove the massive, precisely fitted stones that formed the temple base. And modern acoustic measurements of the remaining chambers show resonance patterns similar to those found in Old World sacred sites, with specific frequencies amplified and others dampened by the precise dimensions and stone placement. And this cannot have been accidental, because achieving such acoustic properties requires either sophisticated understanding or centuries of experimental refinement, or both. At Puma Punku, the mystery deepens further, because here we find the famous H-blocks, massive andesite stones weighing up to 130 tons each, carved with complex geometric shapes, featuring precise right angles, grooves and protrusions that fit together like enormous puzzle pieces. And the nearest quarry capable of providing this red sandstone and andesite lies kilometers away across terrain that would have been nearly impassable with known Incan technology. And yet, the blocks are here perfectly shaped and precisely positioned, though now tumbled and scattered by what appears to have been catastrophic seismic activity or deliberate destruction. Local legends preserved among the Aymara people who have lived in this region for millennia speak of the stones of Puma Punku as having a quality quite different from ordinary stone. They say the stones walked. They say the stones came when they were called. They say the ancients knew words and songs that could make stone move of its own accord. And anthropologists naturally interpret these accounts as origin myths, as explanations invented to fill the gap left by forgotten construction techniques. But the consistency of these accounts with similar legends from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, from Malta, from places the Aymara could never have had contact with through conventional means, suggests either a remarkable coincidence of imagination or a preserved memory of something real. Every culture that built with megaliths tells the same story across oceans, across millennia, across linguistic and cultural barriers that should have prevented any shared mythology from developing. And the story is always the same. The stones listened. The stones moved. The stones came when they were called by those who knew the proper sounds and frequencies. Your breathing has deepened now, and your body feels heavier against the mattress as we travel eastward around the globe to the high mountain plateaus of Tibet, where travelers and researchers in the early 20th century recorded accounts of monks who could levitate stones through the combined power of drumming and chanting. And while such accounts seem fantastical and and certainly demand skeptical scrutiny. The details recorded by some observers are remarkable for their specificity in ways that deserve careful consideration. The most detailed account comes from Swedish aircraft designer Henry Kjellson, who claimed to have received a report from a colleague he called Dr. Jarl, a Swedish physician who allegedly witnessed Tibetan monks levitating large stones up a cliff face to a building site in the 1930s. And while this account has never been independently verified and should be approached with appropriate skepticism, the specific parameters Kjellson recorded are striking because they describe not vague mystical phenomena, but precise physical arrangements that can be analyzed acoustically. According to the account, the monks arranged 19 drums and 13 trumpets in an arc at a specific distance from a large stone to be lifted approximately 63 meters away, and the instruments were positioned to focus their combined sound output toward the stone. And when the monks began playing, maintaining specific rhythmic patterns and tonal relationships, the stone allegedly began to move, rising through the air in a curving trajectory to land on a ledge 250 meters above. And the specificity of these numbers, the exact count of instruments, the precise distances the described trajectory suggests, either elaborate fabrication or genuine observation of some phenomenon the observer struggled to understand. Modern cymatics research has demonstrated that sound waves can indeed move physical objects, that acoustic levitation is not fantasy, but documented physics currently used in laboratory settings to suspend small droplets and particles. And while the scale described in the Tibetan accounts far exceeds anything modern science has achieved, the principles are not impossible, merely unexplored at larger scales. And the acoustic parameters described in the Jarl account, if analyzed through contemporary understanding of sound wave interference and resonance, do not violate physics, but rather suggest a phenomenon at the edge of current scientific capability. Similar accounts emerge from China, where the construction of ancient temples and pagodas is attributed in various historical sources to the power of sacred sounds and incantations, and the Japanese tradition of kotodama, which translates roughly as word spirit or the power inherent in words, holds that specific sounds carry actual physical force that can affect material reality. And this belief influenced Japanese architecture and religious practice for millennia, shaping the chants used in temples and the sounds considered auspicious or dangerous. And while we can certainly interpret this as purely spiritual belief, as metaphor for psychological and social effects of ritual, we should note that these cultures invested enormous resources in precisely controlling sounds in sacred spaces, suggesting they believed the physical effects to be real. A Swedish engineer watching Tibetan monks lift stones with sound presents a claim so extraordinary that our modern sensibilities demand we dismiss it. And perhaps we should remain skeptical about this particular account, given its unverified nature. But the details he recorded, the angles, the distances, the specific number and type of instruments these match patterns, we see described in other traditions, and the coincidence of such specific technical details appearing in an account that, if fabricated, would presumably focus on mystical atmospherics rather than precise measurements, creates a puzzle that simple dismissal does not resolve. Finally, let us return to Europe, to the great stone circles and monuments of the British Isles, where Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century CE, recorded traditions about the construction of Stonehenge that attribute the transportation and erection of those massive stones to the magic of Merlin the Wizard. And while Geoffrey is often dismissed as a fabulist, more concerned with compelling narrative than historical accuracy, his accounts drew on earlier Welsh traditions that themselves reached back into the oral histories of peoples who had lived in Britain for millennia. And in these earlier accounts, the power that moved the stones is consistently described not as general magic, but specifically as song, as the chanting of words in proper sequence and tone. The bluestones of Stonehenge present one of archaeology's enduring puzzles, because these stones, weighing up to 4 tons each, originated in the Preseli Hills of Wales, some 150 miles from the site on Salisbury Plain. And while recent research has demonstrated that glacial action may have transported some stones partway, this does not explain how they were moved the final distance or how they were erected with such precision and conventional explanations, involving wooden sledges, rope, and human muscle, require labor forces and organizational capabilities that exceed what we typically attribute to Neolithic societies. Recent acoustic research at Stonehenge has revealed something that earlier investigations missed, that the arrangement of the stones creates a unique acoustic environment, where sounds generated within the circle are largely prevented from escaping outward, and sounds from outside the circle are significantly dampened before reaching the interior. And this closed acoustic system is precisely what you would want if you were trying to build up specific resonance frequencies within the space to achieve maximum amplitude of particular sounds without interference from external noise. And researchers from the universities of Huddersfield and Bristol confirmed that Stonehenge in its complete form would have functioned as a near-perfect acoustic isolator. The surrounding landscape shows evidence of additional acoustic engineering, because the avenue that leads from the river to the monument follows a path that channels sound in particular ways, and some researchers have proposed that processions approaching Stonehenge would have produced changing acoustic experiences as they move through zones of different resonance and reflection, and the placement of the outlying stones creates interference patterns that further shape sound within and around the main circle, suggesting a level of acoustic awareness that far exceeds what we would expect from people we describe as primitive. Your body is heavier now against the mattress, and the pattern is clear across continents, across millennia, and cultures that never met, all describing the same phenomenon, that stones could be moved through sound, that specific frequencies and precise arrangements of instruments and voices could accomplish what muscle and lever could not. And whether this represents genuine lost technology or remarkable coincidence of myth-making, the consistency demands attention. And let that pattern settle into your awareness without forcing understanding, without needing to reach conclusions, just allowing the recognition that something connects these traditions, something more than random invention. And as you breathe slowly and feel your body sinking deeper into rest, know that these questions have waited thousands of years and can wait a little longer while you drift towards sleep. In 1787, a German physicist named Ernst Chladni did something that would have seemed like sorcery to anyone who witnessed it. He took a thin metal plate, covered it with fine sand, and drew a violin bow across its edge. What happened next defied ordinary expectation. The sand, rather than scattering randomly as you might assume, began to move with purpose. It gathered itself into patterns, are geometric shapes that emerged spontaneously as the plate vibrated at specific frequencies. Lines and curves formed, intersected, created symmetries of startling beauty. Change the frequency slightly and the pattern would dissolve, only to reorganize into an entirely different configuration. Chladni had discovered something profound. He had made sound visible. The patterns that emerged, now known as Chladni figures, revealed that sound waves traveling through matter create regions of movement and regions of stillness, and that particles naturally migrate toward the stillness, the nodes where vibrations cancel each other out. What had been invisible, the architecture of sound itself, suddenly had form. Nearly 2 centuries later, a Swiss physician and natural scientist named Hans Jenny would take this discovery further, dedicating decades of his life to the systematic study of how sound shapes matter. Working in his laboratory in the 1960s and 1970s, Jenny coined the term cymatics, from the Greek chyma, meaning wave, to describe this emerging field. He subjected water, sand, iron filings, and various powders to controlled frequencies, photographing the results with meticulous precision. What his cameras captured seems almost impossible. At 432 Hz, water forms a perfect mandala shape. At slightly different frequencies, the patterns shift, creating forms that look like flowers, like cells dividing, like the cross-sections of fruits and vegetables, like galaxies spiraling through space. Jenny found that when he vibrated water at certain frequencies, the surface would organize into geometric patterns that remained stable as long as the tone continued. Circles within circles, hexagons, triangles, complex lattices of intersecting lines. Some patterns were simple, elegant. Others were extraordinarily intricate, containing wheels within wheels, structures of impossible delicacy held together by nothing but sound. Increase the amplitude and the patterns become more complex. Change the frequency and the entire structure dissolves and reforms into something entirely new. What strikes observers most deeply about cymatic experiments is how organic the patterns appear. At certain frequencies, the structures that emerge look biological, cellular, like living things organizing themselves according to some hidden blueprint. At other frequencies, the patterns match sacred geometric symbols that appear in temples and religious art across cultures and centuries. The 6-petaled flower of life that appears in Egyptian temples, the Sri Yantra of Hindu tradition, the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, the geometric patterns woven into Persian carpets and carved into Islamic mosques. These are not random correspondences. The specific geometric forms that sound creates match, with unsettling precision, the forms that ancient peoples considered sacred enough to carve into their most important structures. Consider what this means. Consider standing in a Sumerian temple 4,500 years ago, watching priests pour water into shallow bronze dishes and then begin to chant. As the specific tones filled the chamber, the water would begin to move, to organize, to form patterns that emerged from seeming chaos. To anyone without knowledge of acoustic physics, this would appear miraculous. The voice of the priest, transformed into visible geometry. The word made flesh, quite literally. If you knew nothing about frequency and vibration, you would be witnessing the gods responding to human prayer. You would be seeing divine order emerge from primordial chaos. You would be watching creation itself. Modern cymatic researchers have demonstrated this phenomenon in countless videos and experiments. Dr. John Stuart Reid, who has studied the acoustics of the Great Pyramid, has created devices called cymoscopes that make sound visible in extraordinary detail. When the human voice is passed through these instruments, it creates unique patterns, fingerprints of sound. When specific musical notes are played, they create specific geometric forms with mathematical precision. A pure tone at 528 Hz creates a perfect hexagonal pattern in water. A different frequency creates a pentagonal form. Another creates concentric circles. Each frequency has its own signature, its own geometry, its own truth written in water and sand and any medium sensitive enough to respond. The ancients drew these same patterns on their walls. They built them into their temples. They wove them into their textiles and carved them into their jewelry. The question that cymatics forces us to ask is whether they were recording what they saw when they made sound visible. Were the mandalas and sacred geometries of the ancient world not inventions, but observations? Did they discover, through ritual and repetition, through generations of priests chanting in acoustically designed spaces, that sound creates form? That specific tones create specific patterns? That the voice of the celebrant, raised in proper pitch, could make the invisible forces of creation temporarily visible? Now let us step from the visible patterns of sound into something even more extraordinary: the ability of sound to move objects, to counteract gravity itself. In the 1930s, scientists began to discover that sound waves could do more than create patterns. They could levitate matter. The first acoustic levitation experiments used high-frequency sound waves directed at small droplets of liquid, holding them suspended in mid-air against the pull of gravity. The physics is relatively straightforward once understood. Sound waves create regions of high and low pressure as they move through air. If you can create a stable pattern of pressure nodes, you can trap small objects in the low pressure zones, holding them suspended by the sound itself. Early experiments were limited to tiny droplets, particles no larger than grains of sand. But the principle had been established. Sound could lift, sound could hold, sound could counteract the most fundamental force in the universe. NASA took interest in acoustic levitation for practical reasons. In the microgravity environment of space, you need ways to position and manipulate samples without touching them. Acoustic positioning became an important tool for space-based material science, allowing researchers to suspend molten materials while they cooled into perfect spheres, undeformed by contact with any container. The technology works. It is documented and repeatable. It is not fantasy or speculation, but engineering, used routinely in laboratories and spacecraft around the world. But the limitations seemed severe. You could levitate small objects, yes, droplets, tiny spheres, particles of a few millimeters at most. Surely this technology could never scale to anything approaching the stones of the ancient world. Then, in 2017, researchers at the University of Bristol achieved something that had been thought impossible. They levitated objects larger than the wavelength of the sound being used. This breakthrough shattered a fundamental limit that had constrained acoustic levitation research for decades. By using rapidly fluctuating acoustic vortices, they created what they called acoustic holograms, three-dimensional sound fields capable of manipulating larger and larger objects. Professor Bruce Drinkwater and his team demonstrated that with properly structured sound fields, the size limit was not as absolute as previously thought. At ETH Zurich in Switzerland, Professor Daniele Foresti has pushed the boundaries further, developing acoustic levitation systems that can manipulate multiple objects simultaneously, moving them through complex trajectories without any physical contact. His work has applications in pharmaceutical manufacturing, where contamination-free manipulation of materials is critical. The technology continues to advance. Each year, researchers levitate larger objects, use lower frequencies, discover new ways to structure sound fields for greater lifting power. The physics is well understood. The relationship between frequency, amplitude, and the mass that can be moved follows predictable mathematical relationships. More power means more lifting capacity. More precisely structured sound fields mean more control. And the question that haunts this research is not whether sound can move objects. It demonstrably can. The question is whether ancient peoples, through millennia of observation and experimentation, discovered these principles before we did. They had no theory of acoustics. They had no mathematics of wave interference or pressure nodes. But they had time. They had countless generations of priests and builders and craftsmen, all experimenting, all observing, all passing down what worked and discarding what did not. They had sacred spaces designed over centuries for their acoustic properties. They had bronze implements and stone chambers, and voices trained from childhood in precise tonal production. And they had a different relationship to sound than we do. For them, sound was not mere vibration of air molecules. Sound was power. Sound was creation. Sound was the voice of the gods made manifest in the material world. Let us descend now into a realm of sound you cannot hear. Below the threshold of human perception, roughly 20 Hz, lies a world of infrasound, frequencies too low to register as tone, but still capable of affecting matter and consciousness. In the early 1980s, an engineer named Vic Tandy was working alone late at night in a laboratory that had a reputation for being haunted. Workers reported feeling a presence, sensing someone watching them, occasionally glimpsing grey shapes at the edge of their vision. Tandy was a skeptic, not inclined to believe in ghosts. But one night, working at his bench, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The hairs on his arms stood up. In his peripheral vision, he caught sight of a grey form, an apparition that seemed to watch him from the corner of the room. When he turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Rather than fleeing in terror, Tandy approached the mystery as an engineering problem. He discovered that a newly installed extractor fan was producing infrasound at 18.9 Hz. This particular frequency, it turns out, matches the resonant frequency of the human eyeball. When exposed to 18.9 Hz infrasound, the eyeball vibrates slightly, causing visual disturbances at the edge of the field of vision, exactly where Tandy had seen his apparition. Further research revealed that infrasound at various frequencies produces a range of physical and psychological effects. Feelings of unease, of being watched, of dread, difficulty breathing, vibrations felt in the chest and abdomen, nausea and disorientation are the symptoms associated with haunted places around the world. Tandy investigated allegedly haunted locations and found that many of them had environmental features, long corridors, wind patterns, mechanical systems that produced infrasound naturally. The ghosts were not spirits of the dead. They were artifacts of frequency. But here is where the research becomes more interesting for our purposes. Dr. Ian Cook, a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, has studied the effects of specific frequencies on human brain activity. Using sophisticated imaging technology, he discovered that exposure to 110 Hz, a frequency well within the range of human hearing, but also capable of powerful physical effects, produces a distinctive shift in brain activity. At 110 Hz, activity in the left prefrontal cortex, the region associated with language, linear thinking, and analytical processing, decreases significantly. Simultaneously, activity in the right prefrontal cortex, associated with spatial reasoning, creativity, and holistic processing, increases. The brain literally shifts its mode of operation in response to this frequency. Why is 110 Hz significant? Because it is the resonant frequency of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Because it is the resonant frequency of the Oracle Chamber in the Hypogeum of Malta, that underground temple carved from living rock 5,500 years ago. Because sacred spaces around the world, when measured for their acoustic properties, reveal this same frequency again and again. The Neolithic passage tombs of Ireland, the painted caves of Paleolithic France, ancient temples across the Mediterranean basin, all of them resonate at or near 110 Hz. The builders of these spaces, across different cultures and different millennia, all created structures that produced the same neurological effect. Was this coincidence? Were they all independently selecting building materials and designing architectural forms that happened to resonate at the exact frequency that shifts human consciousness from analytical to spatial, from verbal to visionary? Or did they know, through generations of observation and ritual practice, that certain spaces changed how people think and feel and perceive? Did they understand, without modern neuroscience, that 110 Hz opens doorways in the mind? That the right frequency, sustained in the right space, could produce visions, could access altered states, could connect the worshipper to something beyond ordinary consciousness? They built spaces that changed how the brain works, not metaphorically, but physically. The stones held frequencies that altered consciousness itself. If the ancients truly possessed acoustic technology capable of moving stone, of inducing altered states, of manipulating matter through precisely controlled sound, then we face a troubling question. Why was this knowledge lost? How could something so powerful simply disappear from human memory? The answer lies in understanding how complex knowledge survives or fails to survive civilizational collapse. Consider Damascus steel, the legendary material of medieval Middle Eastern blades, capable of cutting through European swords and holding an edge that seemed supernaturally sharp. For centuries, Damascus steel was produced in Syria and traded throughout the world. Then, sometime in the 18th century, the knowledge of how to make it was lost. The specific ores, the precise temperatures, the exact sequence of forging and folding, all of it vanished. Despite intensive efforts by metallurgists over the past 2 centuries, we have only recently begun to understand the nanostructures that gave Damascus steel its properties, and we still cannot fully replicate the original production methods. Consider Roman concrete, the material that allowed the Romans to build structures that have lasted 2,000 years, including the Pantheon Dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Roman concrete was stronger and more durable than modern Portland cement. It actually grew stronger over time as seawater interacted with its volcanic components. When the Roman Empire fell, the knowledge of how to make this concrete was lost. It was not rediscovered until the 21st century, when researchers finally identified the specific volcanic ash sources and mixing processes the Romans had used. Consider Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that allowed the Byzantine Empire to defeat naval attacks for centuries. The formula was so secret that it was known only to a few specialists. When Constantinople fell, the knowledge died with them. Despite centuries of attempts, we still do not know exactly how Greek fire was made. Knowledge is fragile. It requires unbroken chains of transmission, stability, resources, specialized materials. When civilizations fall, the most complex technologies go first. The technologies that require rare materials disappear when trade routes collapse. The technologies that require specialized training vanish when the schools close and the masters die. The technologies that require generational practice are lost when war and plague break the transmission from teacher to student. Acoustic manipulation of stone, if it existed, would have been exactly this kind of vulnerable knowledge. It would have required specific instruments made from specific materials, bronze bells of particular alloys, stone chambers of precise dimensions, drums made from particular woods and animal hides. It would have required voices trained from childhood, priests who had spent decades learning the exact pitches and durations and breathing techniques. It would have required the institutional support of temples and kingdoms, and the wealth to maintain facilities and train practitioners, the stability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. When the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, when cities burned and trade networks shattered and populations plummeted, all of this infrastructure would have vanished. The priests who knew the frequencies would have died without passing on their knowledge. The instruments would have been melted down or destroyed. The temples would have fallen silent, and within a few generations, what had been technology would become legend. The survivors would remember that the old priests could move stones with their voices. They would tell their children about the songs that lifted blocks into place. But the specific knowledge, the exact frequencies and techniques and materials, these would be lost forever. And after enough generations, the stories themselves would seem impossible. Mythology, not history. Superstition, not science. Different stones have different resonant frequencies, just as different bells have different tones. Strike a piece of granite and it rings. Strike a piece of limestone and the sound is duller, more muted. The ancients knew this. They must have known it, because the stones they selected for their most sacred sites were not chosen for convenience or proximity. They were transported over vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, when local stone was readily available. The bluestones of Stonehenge were carried 150 miles from the Preseli Hills in Wales. Why? Recent research has revealed something remarkable about these specific stones. When struck, they ring like bells. They are what geologists call ringing rocks or lithophones, natural stones with unusual acoustic properties. The builders of Stonehenge passed by countless other stone sources to obtain these particular stones that could sing. At sites throughout the ancient world, we find similar patterns. The builders chose stones not for their appearance or their weight or their availability, but for their acoustic properties. They tested stones by striking them, listening to their resonance, selecting only those that produced the right tones. They understood at some level that stone is not merely solid matter, but a medium through which vibration can travel, be stored, be amplified. Granite, the building material of choice for many ancient Egyptian structures, has a property that modern engineers find fascinating. It is piezoelectric. When compressed by sound waves, granite generates small electrical currents. When electrical current is applied to granite, it produces mechanical vibrations. The stone itself can convert between acoustic energy and electrical energy. Many of the obelisks and massive structures of ancient Egypt were made of granite, quarried at Aswan and transported hundreds of miles to sites of construction. The Great Pyramid contains massive granite beams in its interior chambers, precisely cut and positioned. If you understood the piezoelectric properties of granite, if you knew how to induce vibrations in the stone itself, you would have a way to make the stone an active participant in its own movement. This is speculative, of course. We have no direct evidence that the ancients understood piezoelectricity, but they did understand resonance, and they understood that certain stones responded to certain tones. They understood that sound could be stored in a space, that a chamber built to particular dimensions would amplify particular frequencies. They understood sympathetic vibration, the phenomenon by which one vibrating object can induce vibration in another object tuned to the same frequency. Think of how a singer can shatter a wine glass by hitting just the right note. The glass has a natural resonant frequency, and when sound at that exact frequency is directed at it with enough amplitude, the glass vibrates so intensely that it shatters. This same principle, applied to stone, could theoretically be used to move rather than destroy. If you could determine the resonant frequency of a massive block, if you could produce that frequency with sufficient amplitude, you could induce the stone to vibrate. A vibrating object is, in a very real physical sense, lighter than a stationary object. The normal forces holding it in place are disrupted. The friction that makes it so difficult to move is reduced. At sufficient amplitude, the stone might begin to move almost of its own accord, responding to the song being sung to it, dancing to the frequency that matched its inner nature. These scientific concepts may blur at the edges of your attention as you drift closer to sleep. That is perfectly fine. The important thing is not mastering the physics, but recognizing the pattern. Ancient accounts and modern science are beginning to speak the same language, a language of vibration, of frequency, of sound. The temples that resonate at 110 Hz. The sacred geometries that match cymatic patterns. The legends of stones that moved when called. The priests who sang in tones we have forgotten. The instruments made from materials we can no longer identify. All of it points in the same direction. The ancients knew something about sound that we are only beginning to remember. Whether they could actually levitate megaliths with their voices remains unproven. But the possibility, once dismissed as fantasy, now rests on more solid ground than skeptics would prefer. The physics allows for it. The ancient accounts describe it. The gap between what we know and what they might have known grows smaller with each new discovery. Let your breathing deepen now. Feel the weight of these ideas settling like sand through water, drifting to the bottom of your consciousness, where they can rest until you are ready to consider them again. The stones are still standing, still holding the frequencies of their creation, still waiting for someone to sing them awake. Now let us return to where we began, to those clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks by scribes who lived and breathed and died 4,000 years before you were born. But this time, let us read them differently. Let us approach them not as scholars cataloguing quaint religious practices of a primitive people, but as investigators examining what might be the operating manuals for a technology we have forgotten how to use. The tablet designated CBS 10996, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains what scholars have long classified as a hymn to the temple of Enlil at Nippur. The translation reads beautifully in English, praising the great mountain house, and describing its foundations reaching into the underworld, its peak touching the heavens. But look closer at the original Sumerian, and something else emerges. The text specifies that the hymn must be sung by 7 voices, not 6, not 8, but precisely 7. And these 7 voices must be divided into specific groupings, 3 voices sustaining a lower tone, while 4 voices execute a rising pattern above them. The duration of each phrase is marked with a precision that seems unnecessary for mere worship. 42 repetitions of one phrase, 17 of another. These are not symbolically significant numbers in Sumerian religious practice. 7 was sacred, 60 was sacred, but 17, 42? These numbers resist symbolic interpretation. They read instead like calibration settings. It was like the specific number of cycles needed to achieve resonance at a particular frequency. The text goes further still, specifying the position of the tongue against the palate, the degree of opening in the throat, the way breath must be drawn from the belly rather than the chest. These instructions have long been interpreted as attempts to ensure proper liturgical pronunciation, to maintain the sacred sounds across generations of priests. But consider another possibility. What if these specifications exist because slight variations in vocal production would produce slightly different frequencies? And frequency precision was essential because the goal was not pleasing the gods, but producing measurable physical effects. The Oshema Lamentations contained similar puzzling details. These were songs of mourning, supposedly, sung when temples were destroyed or cities fell to enemies. But the musical notation accompanying some of these texts reveals something strange. The laments were not sung in the mournful descending patterns we associate with grief. Instead, they feature complex interlocking patterns, multiple voices entering at precise intervals, sustained tones held while other voices execute rapid passages around them. This is not intuitive mourning. This is architecture in sound. And remember where these songs were performed. In temple complexes built with specific acoustic properties, with resonance chambers and curved walls that would amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. The temple of Enki at Eridu, excavated in the 1940s by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, revealed a structure whose acoustic properties could not have been accidental. The inner sanctuary featured a curved rear wall that would focus sound toward a specific point. The walls themselves were constructed of mud brick in a pattern that created regular acoustic reflections at predictable intervals. The British acoustic archaeologist Dr. Rupert Till, who has spent decades measuring the sound properties of ancient sites, noted that many Mesopotamian temple designs show evidence of intentional acoustic engineering. Sound produced in these spaces would not simply dissipate. it would build upon itself, layer after layer, reinforced by the geometry of walls and ceilings, until the entire structure vibrated at the frequency being produced. And here is where the language of the hymns becomes particularly striking. They do not say that Enlil hears the prayer and then responds. They say that when the proper words are spoken in the proper way, the temple itself responds. The stones sing back, the foundations tremble, the mountain house speaks. We have read this as poetic metaphor for divine presence. But what if it is simply description of acoustic resonance? What if the temple literally vibrated when the correct frequencies were produced, and this vibration was the mechanism through which the technology operated? Read this way: the hymns are not requests to the gods. They are operating instructions. The response of the gods, the walls rising, the stones moving, the temple coming alive with power, was not divine favor bestowed upon the faithful. It was physics, the predictable result of producing the correct frequencies in the correct acoustic environment, using the correct technique. Prayer, in this understanding, was not supplication. It was calibration. But if this knowledge existed, if the priests of Sumer and Babylon and Egypt truly understood how to manipulate matter through sound, why did they not write it down clearly? Why bury technical specifications beneath layers of religious language and mythological imagery? Why make it so difficult for us, 4 millennia later, to recognize what they were describing? The answer lies in understanding how power operates, how knowledge becomes currency, how those who possess rare abilities have always sought to protect their monopoly on those abilities. Consider the medieval stonemasons' guilds, the organizations that built the great cathedrals of Europe. These craftsmen possessed genuine expertise, understanding of load-bearing, a knowledge of how to cut stone to precise specifications, techniques for raising massive blocks to great heights. And they guarded this knowledge ferociously. Apprentices were sworn to secrecy. Technical methods were taught through oral tradition only, never written down. Signs and symbols identified guild members to each other while excluding outsiders. The guilds used religious language constantly, invoking divine blessing on their work, claiming that their craft was sacred, that the cathedral rose not through mere human technique, but through cooperation with heavenly powers. Was this sincere piety? Perhaps partially, but it was also excellent marketing and effective security. If your ability to build massive structures was simply a matter of specialized training and accumulated knowledge, then anyone with sufficient dedication could eventually learn it. You would face competition. Your prices would fall. Your social status would decline. But if your ability came from divine favor, from secrets whispered by God to specially chosen initiates, then your monopoly was protected by sacred authority. To challenge your methods was not mere business competition, but blasphemy. The Sumerian priesthood operated on the same principle, but with far more at stake. If you could move stones with sound, if you could reshape the physical world through frequencies and vibrations, you would possess power beyond almost anything else imaginable in the ancient world. You could build temples that demonstrated your divine authority. You could construct fortifications that made your city impregnable. You could create monuments that would awe populations into submission. You would never, ever reveal the actual mechanism behind your power. Instead, you would encode it in religious terminology, in sacred hymns that only trained priests could properly perform, in rituals that required years of initiation to master. You would tell the common people that the gods worked through you, that your voice was the channel for divine power, that the stones moved because Enlil or Marduk or Ptah willed it so. And in a sense, you would not even be lying. Whatever natural force you were manipulating, you could genuinely believe it was divine in nature. The distinction between physics and metaphysics had not yet been drawn. Force and power and spirit and energy were not yet separated into different categories. When the stones moved at the sound of your voice, you could simultaneously understand that you were producing specific frequencies in a specific acoustic environment and believe that you were channeling the creative power of the gods. These were not contradictory interpretations. They were the same interpretation expressed in the only vocabulary available. And as centuries passed, as the original understanding of the mechanism faded, as the reasons behind specific techniques were forgotten, even while the techniques themselves continued to be practiced, the religious interpretation would increasingly dominate. Priests would continue to sing the hymns in the prescribed manner because tradition demanded it, because deviation brought bad fortune, because this was how things had always been done. They would no longer know why 42 repetitions were required rather than 41 or 43. They would no longer understand the acoustic principles behind the throat positioning and breath control, but they would maintain the practices with obsessive precision because somewhere in collective memory there lingered the knowledge that precision mattered, that small variations could mean the difference between the technology working and failing entirely. The Babylonian exile, when the Jewish people were transported to Babylon and exposed to Mesopotamian religious practices, coincided with increased emphasis on exact pronunciation of Hebrew sacred texts. The later tradition of Masoretic notation, those tiny marks indicating precise vowel sounds and cantillation patterns, emerged from a culture that had learned from Babylon the supreme importance of vocal precision in sacred speech. The original reason for this precision, if our interpretation is correct, had already been lost. But the insistence on exact replication remained, a fossil of technological understanding preserved in religious practice, technology becoming ritual, becoming superstition, becoming mystery. This is how technology becomes magic. Not through deception primarily, though deception certainly played a role, but through the passage of time, through the breaking of transmission chains, through the transformation of understanding into mere repetition. The technology does not stop working, at least not immediately. Priests continue to chant in the prescribed manner, and sometimes in the right acoustic environment with sufficient skill, something still happens. Stones vibrate, walls hum. Strange phenomena occur that reinforce belief in divine power even as the actual mechanism remains invisible. And eventually, the acoustic environments themselves decay. Temples fall to invaders or earthquakes or simple time. The precisely engineered resonance chambers crack and collapse. The amplifying geometries are destroyed. The technology stops working entirely because the infrastructure it required no longer exists. But the myths persist. The stories of walls rising at the sound of trumpets, of stones floating at the command of sages, these become mythology, become folklore, become the obvious exaggerations of primitive peoples who did not understand the world as we do. We lose the knowledge twice over. Once, when the priests stopped understanding the physics and converted it entirely to religion, and again, when we who inherit the texts refuse to consider that physics might have been involved at all. The question then becomes whether this knowledge can be recovered, whether the fragments preserved in clay tablets and temple ruins and global mythology might yet be reassembled into working technology. The answer is genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty itself is important. We must resist both the temptation to declare ancient acoustic technology definitely real and proven, and the equally strong temptation to dismiss it as impossible pseudoscience. What we can say is that modern physics demonstrates acoustic levitation to be genuinely possible within certain parameters. Researchers at the University of Bristol have levitated objects larger than the wavelength of sound being used, breaking a barrier once thought fundamental. Scientists at Argonne National Laboratory routinely suspend droplets of liquid in mid-air using ultrasonic standing waves. NASA has used acoustic positioning to manipulate materials in microgravity environments. The phenomenon is real. Sound can move matter. The questions are whether the ancients discovered this empirically, whether they developed techniques for scaling it up, and whether they possessed materials or methods we do not yet understand. On the first question, the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Human beings are remarkably good at discovering natural phenomena through patient observation and experimentation, even without understanding the underlying physics. The development of metallurgy proceeded for thousands of years without anyone knowing what atoms were. Selective breeding transformed wolves into dogs and wild grasses into wheat without any knowledge of genetics. Traditional medicines identified effective treatments through trial and error long before clinical trials and molecular biology. If certain frequencies produced visible effects on certain materials under certain conditions, patient practitioners could have catalogued these effects, refined their techniques, developed systems of knowledge that worked reliably even without theoretical understanding. We know the ancients were sophisticated observers of acoustic phenomena because we have their musical instruments, their architectural acoustics, their detailed notation systems. They were not naive about sound. On the second question, scaling acoustic effects to move megaliths weighing dozens or hundreds of tons, we enter more speculative territory. Modern acoustic levitation works on small objects because the relationship between acoustic pressure and gravitational force favors small masses. To levitate a 50-ton stone would require energies far beyond what human voices can produce, far beyond what drums and horns can generate. Unless there are factors we do not understand, unless the precise geometry of ancient temple complexes created amplification effects we have not measured, unless specific materials, bronze alloys of particular compositions, stone surfaces of particular properties, created resonance conditions that enhanced acoustic forces dramatically. Unless standing waves could be established in precisely engineered environments that cancelled gravitational effects through mechanisms our physics has not yet described. These are big unlesses. They require phenomena beyond current scientific confirmation. But current scientific understanding is not complete. We know this because physics itself tells us so. Quantum mechanics and general relativity remain incompatible. Dark matter and dark energy comprise most of the universe and remain unexplained. We continue to discover new phenomena, new particles, new effects. The history of science is in large part the history of declaring things impossible and then discovering them to be real. We could not prove 100 years ago that space could be bent, or that particles could be entangled across distances, or that energy and matter were interchangeable. And on the third question, whether the ancients possessed materials or methods we cannot replicate, there is precedent. Damascus steel, produced for centuries in the Middle East, possessed properties that modern metallurgy struggled for decades to reproduce. The exact recipe was lost when the supply chain for the specific ores was disrupted. Roman concrete, which has lasted 2,000 years in seawater, while modern concrete degrades in decades, involved volcanic ash and seawater reactions that we are only now beginning to understand. The Stradivarius violins, crafted 3 centuries ago, produce sounds that modern instruments cannot match despite every attempt at replication, possibly due to specific properties of the wood from trees grown during the Little Ice Age. If we have lost the ability to replicate materials made mere centuries ago, how much more might we have lost from civilizations millennia distant? Some researchers have proposed that specific bronze alloys, cast using ores from particular mines now exhausted, might have had acoustic properties we cannot recreate. Others suggest that the patient training of voices over generations, techniques passed from teacher to student through entire lifetimes of practice, might have achieved effects that cannot be replicated by modern researchers experimenting for a few years. The intersection of archaeology and physics in this domain remains largely unexplored. Now, archaeologists are trained to measure and catalogue physical artifacts, not to analyze their acoustic properties. Physicists are trained to work with modern materials and controlled conditions, not to consider how ancient craftsmanship might have produced unexpected effects. The interdisciplinary work that might actually test these hypotheses, bringing together acoustic engineers and cuneiform scholars, physicists and temple architects, remains rare and underfunded. Perhaps the technology is not completely lost. Perhaps it is waiting, encoded in tablets we have been reading as religion, carved into stones we have been measuring only as archaeology. Perhaps a sufficiently creative researcher combining the right disciplines might yet decode the instructions and, in precisely reconstructed acoustic environments, using carefully researched materials, demonstrate that the ancients could indeed move stone with sound. Or perhaps the whole theory will prove a beautiful dead end, a compelling pattern that ultimately leads nowhere. Another addition to the long history of mysteries that seemed to promise hidden knowledge and delivered only interesting questions. Either outcome would be valuable. Either would teach us something about the ancient world and about ourselves. What would it mean if the theory proved true? How would confirmed ancient acoustic technology change our understanding of human history? The implications would be profound, but perhaps not in the direction some might expect. This does not require aliens. It does not require Atlantis or lost continents or ancient astronauts. It requires only that human beings, given sufficient time and motivation, discovered through patient empirical observation principles of acoustics that we are only now beginning to understand through physics. This is consistent with everything we know about human intelligence and curiosity. We have always been experimenters, tinkerers, observers. Give any human population a few thousand years in a stable environment, and they will learn its secrets, catalogue its patterns, develop technologies perfectly adapted to local conditions, even without any theory of why those technologies work. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using wave patterns and star positions and the behavior of birds, without any knowledge of cartography or astronomy in the modern sense. The indigenous peoples of Australia managed landscapes with fire for tens of thousands of years, maintaining ecological balance through techniques that modern fire science is only beginning to appreciate. The ancient Chinese developed acupuncture charts that modern imaging reveals correspond to actual anatomical structures they could not have seen. Human beings are very, very good at figuring things out, given enough time. If acoustic manipulation of matter is physically possible, if the right frequencies in the right conditions can move stone, then it would be stranger if no ancient culture ever discovered this than if several did. And if they discovered it in one place, the knowledge could have spread through trade routes and migrations, and the simple human tendency to share useful information. The remarkable similarity of megalithic construction techniques worldwide might not indicate a single Atlantean source civilization, though that remains one possibility. It might simply indicate a technology that multiple cultures discovered independently or learned from each other through networks of contact we have not yet fully mapped. The more radical implication is not about the past, but about the present. If the ancients had technology, then they had different technology, not inferior primitive attempts at what we have now perfected, but genuinely alternative approaches to manipulating the physical world. They achieved results we cannot currently replicate through methods we do not currently understand. This challenges the assumption of linear progress that underlies so much modern thinking. The belief that each generation knows more than the previous one, that knowledge only accumulates, that the present represents the peak of human capability. What if some peaks are behind us as well as ahead? What if there are paths we abandoned, methods we forgot, ways of working with the physical world that we are only now beginning to glimpse again through the long detour of modern physics? This would not diminish our own achievements. We have done extraordinary things, split atoms, decoded genomes, walked on the moon, connected the planet through invisible signals. But it might humble us slightly to recognize that ancient humans, working with different assumptions and different methods, may have achieved effects we cannot yet reproduce. The stones of Puma Punku still fit together with precision we struggle to match. The great pyramids still align to cardinal directions with accuracy that challenges our surveying. The walls of Sacsayhuamán still stand after 5 centuries of earthquakes, while Spanish colonial buildings have repeatedly collapsed. Something was known that we have not yet recovered. Perhaps it was simply patience, generations of accumulated skill, social organization we cannot imagine sustaining. Perhaps it was acoustic technology, or perhaps something else entirely. But whatever it was, it worked, and we have not yet fully understood how. The appropriate response is not to claim certainty in either direction. It is not to insist that ancient acoustic technology definitely existed, nor to insist that it definitely did not. It is to remain genuinely curious, genuinely open to evidence, genuinely humble about the limits of our current understanding. The tablets wait in their museum cases. The ruins stand under desert suns and jungle canopies. The frequencies are still there, encoded in notation systems we are still learning to read. Embedded in architecture, we are still learning to measure. Perhaps one day, a researcher will put together the right combination of disciplines, will reconstruct the right acoustic environment, will translate the right hymn with the right understanding, and will demonstrate for a startled world that the stones can indeed move at the sound of a voice. Or perhaps the mystery will remain a mystery, a beautiful, unanswered question about what the ancients knew that we have forgotten. Either way, the seeking is worthwhile. Either way, the questions matter. Either way. The ancient scribes who pressed their frequencies into clay did so for a reason. And understanding that reason, even if we never fully succeed, connects us to them across the vast silence of millennia. The ancients knew that sound could move stones, but they also knew something perhaps even more profound, that sound could move consciousness itself. And tonight, as these ideas settle into the quiet spaces of your awareness, you are experiencing exactly what they understood, that the right frequencies, the right patterns, the right vibrations can carry awareness from one state to another. Your brain right now is shifting through frequency ranges that neuroscientists have mapped with precision. When you are fully alert, problem-solving, analyzing your brain produces beta wave cycling at roughly 14 to 30 times per second. As you begin to relax, as the tension leaves your shoulders and your breathing deepens, you shift into alpha waves, 8 to 14 cycles per second. The frequency of calm wakefulness, of daydreaming, of that pleasant drift between doing and being. And as sleep approaches, as the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin, your brain descends further into theta waves, 4 to 8 cycles per second. The frequency of deep meditation, of hypnagogic states of the threshold between worlds. The Sumerian priests knew this. They may not have measured it in hertz. They may not have attached electrodes to the scalps of meditating monks. But they knew that certain sounds, certain rhythms, certain repetitions could carry the mind from ordinary awareness into something else. This is why their hymns specified exact repetitions, why certain chants had to continue for precise durations, why the temple rituals demanded specific sequences of tones. They were not merely worshipping, they were navigating. They were using sound as a vehicle to move consciousness through states, the way they used sound as a tool to move stone through space. The frequency of 110 hertz that we found resonating in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid that we discovered built into the oracle room at the Hypogeum of Malta. This frequency does something measurable to the human brain. Dr. Ian Cook at UCLA demonstrated that exposure to 110 Hz shifts activity from the left prefrontal cortex, the region associated with language and analytical processing, to the right prefrontal cortex associated with creativity, spatial awareness and emotional processing. The ancients built spaces that literally changed how people thought, not metaphorically, not spiritually in some vague, untestable sense, physically, measurably, documentably. And lower, still below the range of human hearing, the infrasound frequencies between 7 and 19 Hz, these affect us too, even though we cannot consciously perceive them. Vic Tandy discovered that 18.9 Hz causes the human eyeball to resonate in its socket, creating peripheral visual disturbances that the brain interprets as ghostly presences. Many spaces we consider haunted turn out to produce infrasound through wind patterns, through mechanical vibration, through architectural acoustics. The ancients built temples that generated these frequencies. Were they creating sacred spaces that genuinely felt different, that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck, that filled you with awe and the sense of something present, something watching, something vast? They were engineering experience through frequency. And tonight, you are part of that same ancient current. The rhythm of these words, the cadence of this voice, the gentle descent through ideas into imagery, into sensation. This, too, is a frequency pattern designed to move your consciousness from waking towards sleep. You are doing what humans have done for tens of thousands of years, letting sound carry you somewhere, letting vibration move, not stone, but awareness itself. Somewhere right now in Istanbul, the archaeological museum has closed for the night. The guards have made their final rounds. The fluorescent lights have flickered off one by one, leaving only the dim emergency lighting and the pale glow of exit signs. In the Mesopotamian gallery, the tablet we began with still rests in its climate-controlled case. The clay has not changed in 4,000 years, and it will not change tonight. The wedge-shaped impressions that encode what might be music, or might be mathematics, or might be something we have no word for, yet they wait in darkness as they have waited through the fall of Babylon, through the rise and collapse of Persia, through the conquests of Alexander, through Roman legions and Islamic scholars and Ottoman administrators, through world wars and revolutions and the entire span of what we call modern history. The tablet does not know that the museum is closed. It does not know that you exist somewhere across the planet, listening to words that attempt to decode its meaning. It simply waits, as it has always waited, holding its frequencies in frozen silence until someone with the knowledge to read them properly comes along. And perhaps that someone is not a single scholar in a single lifetime. And perhaps the decoding happens across generations. Perhaps Anne Kilmer at Berkeley contributed something, and the acoustic researchers in Malta contributed something, and the Cymatics scientists in their laboratories contributed something, and you tonight contribute something too. Not through analysis, but through reception. Through allowing the possibility to exist in your awareness. Through carrying the question forward into your dreams, where the mind works in patterns that waking consciousness cannot access. Perhaps understanding comes not through solving, but through holding, through refusing to close the mystery too soon. The tablet waits. You wait. And something is transmitted across the millennia, not despite the distance, but because of it. Because some knowledge cannot be given directly. It can only be encoded and trusted and released into the long current of human wandering. Somewhere tonight, the stones of Göbekli Tepe are cooling under Turkish stars. Those T-shaped pillars carved with animals and symbols we still do not fully understand. They stand as they have stood for nearly 12,000 years, holding whatever knowledge they hold in patient silence. The archaeologists have gone home. The site is dark. Only the stars look down as they did. When the builders first shaped these stones, first moved them into place through whatever means they used. The stones do not explain themselves. They simply are. And in being, they pose a question that cannot be answered, only received. Somewhere tonight, the megaliths of Stonehenge stand in English mist. The bluestones brought 150 miles from Wales. The massive sarcens, weighing up to 25 tons each. All of them arranged with precision that aligns with solar and lunar events. All of them still keeping whatever sonic properties they were chosen for. When struck, the bluestones ring like bells. Someone knew this. Someone selected these specific stones from all the stones in Wales because they sing. And tonight, they stand in fog and silence, having sung for whoever built them, having rung with hammers and celebration and ritual for generations, now standing quiet. But the potential for song is still there. The frequency is still encoded in the mineral structure. the stones wait for the voice that knows how to wake them. Somewhere tonight, the walls of Sacsayhuamán hold their perfect silence in Peruvian darkness. Those stones, fitted so precisely that 500 years of earthquakes have not shifted them, while Spanish colonial buildings have fallen and been rebuilt again and again. Stones weighing over 100 tons, cut with angles that seem impossible, lifted and placed with precision that modern engineers find difficult to explain. The Andean night is cold at that altitude. The stars burn bright in thin air, and the walls stand as they have stood since before the Spanish came, before the Inca themselves, perhaps before the cultures whose names we do not even know. Holding knowledge, waiting, all of them built by people who knew something we are only beginning to remember, something about sound and stone and the frequencies that move the world. And you, here now, wherever you are, lying in darkness or dim light, your breathing has slowed. Your body has grown heavy. The weight of these ideas has settled not as burden, but as ballast, grounding you, preparing you for the crossing. Let your breath deepen. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you, the mattress or cushion or seat. Feel gravity doing its patient work, holding you. You do not need to hold yourself tonight. The earth holds you. It has been holding your ancestors for 300,000 years of human existence, and it will go on holding those who come after you. You are part of a chain that stretches back through the Sumerians, through the builders of the Megaliths, through the first humans who noticed that certain sounds made patterns in sand, made water dance, made something in the chest resonate with something outside the chest. You carry their questions. You carry their wondering. And tonight, you carry it down into sleep, where the mind works differently, where the barriers between knowing and not knowing grow thin, where dreams might speak, in frequencies that waking ears cannot hear. If this journey through the singing stones and the silent tablets has stayed with you, if these questions about sound and frequency and the technologies we may have forgotten feel worth exploring further, a gentle like helps other wanderers find these paths through history and mystery. Consider subscribing if you want to continue these explorations into the hidden corners of the past, where the boundary between mythology and technology blurs, where the things we were taught to dismiss as primitive superstition begin to look like encoded knowledge. More journeys wait, more tablets, more stones, more frequencies that might just carry the memory of how our ancestors moved the world. But for now, let all of that drift. Let the questions dissolve into the larger darkness, the darkness that holds the stars and the spaces between stars, the darkness that held the earth before there were eyes to see light, the darkness that your ancestors knew as the Great Mother, the source and the return. You are safe in this darkness. It is not absence. It is presence without form. It is the frequency before frequency, the silence from which all sound emerges. The ancients pressed their symbols into clay. We press ours into pixels. But the question remains the same. What frequencies will move the future? What songs will build the world to come? You do not need to answer tonight. The questions will keep. They have kept for millennia. They will keep a little longer while you rest, while you dream. While your brain cycles down through alpha, into theta, into delta, the deep, dreamless sleep where restoration happens, where the body heals, where the mind integrates everything it has received. Perhaps you will dream of singing stones. Perhaps you will stand in a temple you have never visited and hear frequencies you have never heard, and know something you cannot bring back into waking, but that changes you nonetheless. Perhaps you will simply sleep, deeply and well, without dreams you remember, and wake tomorrow slightly different, carrying a question you cannot quite name, but that hums beneath your thoughts like a frequency just below hearing. The stones are listening still. The tablets wait in their cases. The frequencies encoded 4,000 years ago are patient. They have outlasted empires. They can wait for you to wake. They can wait for humanity to remember. Sleep well, dream deep, and know that somewhere right now the world is vibrating with patterns we have not yet learned to hear. Good night.